Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the ancient Appalachians fold in upon themselves like secrets too terrible to tell, there exist places the modern world has never truly found. Here, in the perpetual twilight of the deep woods, time moves to a different rhythm, and the lines between family and fate become dangerously blurred. The mountains keep their secrets well, guarding them in the damp, loamy earth and the sighing of the wind through the pines. But sometimes, a secret grows too large to be contained. Sometimes, it bleeds out into the open, a slow, stubborn stain on the land itself. Our story drifts back to the winter of 1957, to a forgotten corner of Ellerslie County, where a local physician, Dr. Thomas Harrington, first laid eyes upon a malady that would later be whispered as the Shelton syndrome. This is not merely a story of illness, but of a legacy written in bloodlines that turned back upon themselves, generation after generation, in the secluded valleys of Appalachia. It is a story that begins not with a medical file, but with a rumor, carried down from the high ridges like a bitter wind. Dr. Thomas Harrington was a man caught between two worlds. A native of Lexington, he had come to the mountains a decade prior, driven by a sense of service that some called noble and others called foolish. He had set up a modest practice in Boonville, the Ellerslie County seat, and had learned that medicine here was as much about navigating deep-rooted suspicion as it was about diagnosing ailments. His arrival at the Shelton land was precipitated by a visit from a trembling, wide-eyed Bible salesman named Hezekiah Brown. Brown had stumbled upon the compound while lost, seeking shelter from a gathering storm. "They ain't like regular folks, Doc," Brown had whispered in Harrington's office, his hands clutching a cold cup of coffee. "The children, their eyes are set too far apart, like they're always surprised. And some of 'em, their hands shake like they've got the palsy, and they're no older than 8 or 9. The old man, Elijah, he told me they was touched by the mountain, that it was a sign of favor. But it ain't favor, document. It's something else. Something wrong." Intrigued and duty-bound, Harrington secured a reluctant guide, a local store owner named Silas Gentry, one of the few outsiders who had any regular contact with the Sheltons, trading moonshine and cured meats for bullets, salt, and cloth. The journey was a trial in itself. The single-track dirt road, Little Bear Creek Trail, was little more than a scar on the mountain's face, winding up through leafless hickory and oak. The air grew colder, sharper. After 2 hours, Gentry pulled his mule to a halt before a massive fallen poplar, deliberately dragged across the path. "This is as far as I go, Doc," Gentry said, his eyes avoiding Harrington's. "The rest, you walk. They'll be watchin' you already. Remember, they don't think like you and me. Their law is the family. Their truth is the blood." Harrington shouldered his medical bag and proceeded on foot. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his boots on frozen leaves and the distant cry of a hawk. He felt the weight of unseen eyes. Finally, the valley opened up before him, a narrow, flat clearing nestled between two steep, wooded ridges. A creek, partially frozen, snaked through its center. And clustered around it were a series of log cabins, connected by covered porches and muddy paths. Wood smoke hung low in the air, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something faintly metallic and sour. This was the Shelton compound. It wasn't a town, nor a farm, but a self-contained universe. "The first time I approached the Shelton homestead," Dr. Harrington would later confide in his journal, "a profound unease settled in my bones. It was more than the isolation. It was the stillness. 3 generations dwelled in a cluster of cabins around a central clearing, and the resemblance between them was more than familial. It was a haunting repetition of distinctive features, the same wide-set, pale blue eyes, the same slight downturn of the mouth, the same prominent brow, a pattern of abnormality that seemed to echo through the bloodline, growing more pronounced with each passing year. It was like looking at a face reflected in a series of progressively warped mirrors. He was met by a group of men, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and hostility. They were led by Elijah Shelton, who emerged from the largest cabin. At 79, Elijah was a tall, gaunt figure, his back straight as a rifle barrel, his face a roadmap of deep lines. But his eyes held the same piercing, wide-set quality Harrington would soon see in the children. "You're the government doctor," Elijah stated, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. "I'm Dr. Harrington from Boonville. I heard some of your children might be sick. I'd like to help, if I can." Elijah's gaze was unwavering. "We care for our own. The mountain provides, and the mountain takes. It's not for outsiders to question its ways." But Harrington was persistent, appealing to a shared humanity. Reluctantly, Elijah granted him permission to examine the young uns, but his presence was a constant, watchful shadow. The family's history, as Harrington would piece together from fragments of conversation and later from courthouse records, was a story of retreat. Elijah's grandfather, Mordecai Shelton, had fought for the Confederacy not out of passion for the cause, but for a promised bounty. He returned to the mountains disillusioned, harboring a deep, abiding hatred for the federal government he was sure would confiscate his land. He fortified his isolation, marrying a woman from the neighboring Ross family, and instilled in his children a creed of mistrust. His son, and then his grandson Elijah, continued the tradition. Elijah, in 1895, had married his first cousin, Sarah Ross, formally weaving the two family trees into a tight, inseparable knot. From that point, the family tree began to twist in upon itself, its branches intertwining with only two other local families, the Rosses and the Bennets, until the very words cousin, aunt, and uncle had lost their common meaning. The tree had become a thicket, a tangled web of shared DNA where recessive traits, once dormant, began to wake from their long slumber. Harrington's initial examination in the dim, smoky light of the main cabin confirmed the Bible salesman's terrified account. But the reality was far worse than he could have imagined. He wasn't looking at one disease, but a cascade of them, all stemming from a single, tragic source. He started with the children. Of the 19 under the age of 18, 14 showed clear signs of what he could only term genetic deterioration. There were the physical markers: microcephaly, unusually small heads, widely spaced eyes, hypertelorism, and malformed jaws that made speech and eating difficult. There were cognitive impairments. Some children were merely slow, while others lived in a perpetual, foggy childhood, their mental age frozen at 5 or 6 years old. But most disturbing was the progressive neurological disorder. It began innocuously enough, a slight tremor in the hands of an 8-year-old boy as he tried to hold a cup of water. A 9-year-old girl whose gait was slightly unsteady. Harrington knew these were the early warnings. In the older generation, he saw the full, horrifying progression. Miriam Shelton, aged 32, was a ghost of a woman. Seated in a rocking chair by the fire, her body was in constant, writhing motion, a chaotic dance she could not control. Her arms jerked, her head lolled, and when she tried to speak to Harrington, her words were a thick, unintelligible slurry. A younger woman, who he learned was her sister-in-law, gently wiped drool from her chin. "It comes on in their 20s, the woman whispered. "The shakes. Then they get slow. Then, they ain't themselves no more." Elijah watched this interaction, his face a stony mask. Miriam was the cleverest of her bunch, he said, a hint of old pride breaking through. Could read near anything. The mountain chose her for a heavy burden. But it was the case of young Emmet Shelton, age 9, that truly chilled Harrington to his core. The boy was brought forward by his mother, a woman who looked decades older than her years. Emmet was listless, his scalp patchy with hair loss, his skin covered in weeping, scaly lesions. He was small for his age, and his breathing was a shallow, raspy effort. "He catches every cough and fever that goes round," his mother said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "He's been like this since he was 6. Just fading." Harrington's mind raced. The symptoms were a perfect mimic of chronic radiation poisoning. But there were no power plants, no X-ray machines, no uranium in these pristine mountains. The poison wasn't in the air, the water, or the soil. It was in the code of life itself, a defective blueprint passed from parent to child, its effects amplified each time two carriers came together. The most chilling case was that of young M. Shelton. Harrington wrote that night in his journal, the kerosene lamp casting long shadows in his Boonville office. He had never left this pristine valley, yet he presented with symptoms that mimicked a profound, invisible poison, his hair falling out, his skin marred by lesions, his body defenseless. He is a boy living in a biological prison, sentenced by the shared blood of his parents. The source was not of the environment. It was in the blood. It is a hereditary curse, plain and simple. He estimated that 5 children had already been lost to severe congenital heart defects, a mortality rate that was staggering. This isolation was more than geographical. As Harrington probed deeper on subsequent visits, bringing small gifts of candy for the children and tobacco for the men, he unearthed the deep-seated lore that cemented their fate. It was a story passed down from Mordecai, the Confederate veteran. "The government always lies," Elijah told him one afternoon, whittling a piece of cedar with a sharp knife. "My granddaddy seen it. They promise and they take. They smile and they stab. They brought the taxes and the laws that weren't ours. Here, we have our own laws. The law of kin. The outside world carries a sickness of the spirit. We stay pure to stay strong." Harrington looked around the clearing at the visible evidence of profound genetic weakness. "They believed the outside world wished them harm," he wrote. And in a tragic irony, this very belief led them to practices that wrought the gravest harm upon themselves. As the winter of 1957 deepened, Dr. Harrington became a reluctant pilgrim to the Shelton property. Each visit was a delicate negotiation. He was making progress, slowly charting the family genealogy, drawing a twisted tree of interconnected lines. He was gaining a measure of trust, particularly from the women, who bore the brunt of caring for the afflicted. It was on his 4th visit that he first met Joseph Shelton. Joseph was 22, Elijah's grandson, and he had just returned home. He was different immediately. He stood straighter, his eyes held a knowledge the others lacked, and he wore the faint remnants of a military haircut. He had been drafted into the army, served 18 months in Georgia before his own body betrayed him. The early tremors had begun, leading to a medical discharge. Joseph watched Harrington examine his young cousins with a sharp, pained intelligence. "You know what this is, don't you, Doc?" Joseph said quietly, drawing Harrington aside near the woodpile. His hands, Harrington noted, had a barely perceptible shake. "I have my suspicions, Joseph. It's in the family lines. The fact that your folks have married cousins for generations." Joseph nodded, his jaw tight. "In basic training, they showed us films. About chemicals, about radiation. The boys in my unit, they came from all over, cities, farms. None of them had families that looked like this. None of them had brothers who died as babies, or sisters who, like Miriam." He looked out over the compound, his eyes taking in the scene not with familial love, but with a new, horrifying clarity. "I thought it was just our lot. The mountains touch, like Grandpa says. But now I ain't so sure." Joseph was the first crack in the monolith. He was the heretic who had seen the wider world and could no longer accept the insular dogma of his ancestors. Harrington knew he needed expert help. The data he was collecting was anecdotal, observational. He needed genetics, a field still in its infancy. He compiled his notes and presented them to a meeting of colleagues at the University of Kentucky Medical Center in the spring of 1958. The reception was cool, steeped in discomfort. "Tom, these are backward people," one senior physician said, waving a dismissive hand. "Poor nutrition, hookworm, lead poisoning from their stills, that's your answer. You're seeing a psychosocial complex, not a genetic one. The topic is distasteful," another added. "Cousin marriage? It's not something for a reputable medical journal." Harrington faced their skepticism with grim determination. He was certain of what he had seen. Upon returning to Boonville, he wrote a long, detailed letter to Dr. Eleanor Wainwright, a renowned geneticist at Johns Hopkins University who had published groundbreaking work on isolated populations in the Swiss Alps. Dr. Wainwright's response was immediate and electrifying. She saw the profound significance in Harrington's account. This was a natural laboratory, a human population isolated long enough to reveal the stark mechanics of recessive inheritance, free from the confounding variables of a mixed gene pool. She agreed to come to Kentucky. Dr. Eleanor Wainwright was a small, precise woman in her 50s with a mind like a steel trap. She arrived in Ellerslie County in June of 1958, and her presence at the Shelton compound was even more alien than Harrington's. She carried no black bag, just a notebook and a calm, analytical gaze that missed nothing. She spent 2 days there, taking detailed histories, examining eyes, hands, and gaits, and speaking softly with Joseph, who had become their reluctant inside source. She pored over the Shelton family Bible, its fragile pages containing a century and a half of births, marriages, and deaths. The story was written there in stark, simple terms. What we are witnessing is the magnification of a genetic shadow, Dr. Wainwright wrote in her own notes, later published in her seminal paper. When kin marry kin, recessive traits, flaws, if you will, that might otherwise slumber in the blood are awakened. Each child is a lottery. In a normal population, the odds of drawing 2 copies of a rare, harmful gene are astronomically low. But here, where everyone is a carrier, the odds are terrifyingly high. In a population such as this, we are seeing a magnifying glass held over the family's hidden weaknesses. It's not that they have unique genes, it's that their practices have guaranteed these genes will meet. She pointed to the Bible's entries. The turning point was clear, around 1880, as Mordecai's isolationist philosophy took full hold, the infant mortality rate doubled. By 1910, the first cryptic references to the shaking sickness appeared. By the 1950s, it was a plague upon the house. Tragedy, as it so often does, became the catalyst for change. In July of 1958, Miriam Shelton, whose body had been a prison for a decade, died. She choked during a particularly violent tremor episode, unable to clear her own airway. Her death occurred in the main cabin, surrounded by her family, but beyond their help. The event shattered the fragile normalcy of the compound. For Joseph, it was the final, terrible proof. The old ways were a death sentence. He sought out Dr. Harrington. "It has to stop, Doc," Joseph said, his voice raw with grief and anger. "We can't keep doing this. We're burying our own children. We're watching our sisters and brothers turn into that." He gestured vaguely towards the cabin where Miriam's body lay. "Grandpa and the others, they're scared. They think if we change, we disappear. But I think we're disappearing anyway." A silent war erupted within the family. The old guard, led by the immovable Elijah, saw any change as a betrayal of Mordecai's legacy and a surrender to the outside world. The younger generation, led by Joseph and his shell-shocked cousins, saw only a future of suffering and decay. The compound, once a unified fortress, was now divided by a chasm of fear and dawning hope. The winter of 1958–59 was one of the coldest on record. Snow fell in relentless, heavy blankets, sealing the Shelton Valley from late December through much of January. Dr. Harrington was trapped in Boonville, his anxiety growing with each passing day. He knew the tension he'd left behind was a powder keg. Inside the compound, the isolation amplified the conflict. The arguments between Joseph and his grandfather grew louder, more bitter. The suffering of the children, confined to the smoky cabins, was a constant, grim backdrop. Joseph looked at his young cousins, Martha and John, ages 6 and 4. Both were showing the early signs. Martha's speech was badly delayed. John had a persistent, fine tremor in his hands. He saw Miriam in them. He saw his own future. In mid-January, a brief, false thaw created a narrow window of passability on Little Bear Creek Trail. Joseph saw his chance. He made a decision that would brand him a traitor and a savior in equal measure. He told his mother he was taking the children to check rabbit snares. Instead, he bundled Martha and John onto the family's old mule-drawn sled and made the perilous, slushy journey down to Boonville. He went not to the doctor's office, but directly to the county courthouse, marching into the office of Judge Wilfred Davis with the two wide-eyed, visibly afflicted children in tow. Judge Davis was a local man, steeped in the region's live and let live ethos. He listened, stunned, as Joseph made his plea. "Your Honor, I'm Joseph Shelton. These are my kin, Martha and John. I'm asking for the state to take them. They're being denied proper medical care on account of my family's beliefs. The way we live, the marrying inside the family, it's killing us. It's a slow poison. I've seen it. I'm starting to get the shakes myself. These kids deserve a chance at a different life. I love my family, but some traditions deserve to die." Judge Davis was deeply reluctant. Taking children from their kin was an extreme measure, one that went against the grain of the entire community. But then he looked at Martha and John. He saw their malformed features, their tremors, their confusion. He remembered the disturbing reports from Dr. Harrington. The medical evidence was undeniable. Faced with an unprecedented situation, Judge Davis made a fateful ruling. He ordered Martha and John Shelton to be temporarily placed in the custody of the Kentucky Department of Public Welfare for immediate medical evaluation. The news, as it always does in small towns, spread like wildfire. Silas Gentry, the store owner, heard it from the mailman and told a cousin who was married to a Shelton. By nightfall, a runner had slogged his way up to the compound. The reaction was volcanic. Elijah Shelton, despite his 79 years, was incensed. To him, this was the prophecy of Mordecai fulfilled. The government had finally come to steal their children. He rallied the men of the family. They gathered their hunting rifles, old Springfields and lever-action Winchesters, and descended upon Boonville. The scene at the courthouse on February 3, 1959, was one of near-Gothic drama. Elijah, flanked by a dozen of his armed sons and grandsons, stood on the snow-covered steps, his voice echoing off the brick facade. "Davis," he roared. "You bring out my kin. These are our children, our blood. The government has no right to steal them because they don't like our ways. We've lived in these mountains since before Kentucky was a state. We know how to care for our own." Judge Davis, pale but resolute, stood in the doorway, shielded by a nervous Sheriff Miller and his two deputies. The air was thick with the potential for violence. A single twitch of a finger on a trigger could have turned the snow red. It was Dr. Harrington who pushed his way through the crowd. He stood between the two groups, his hands raised. "Elijah, no one is stealing your children. They are sick, and Joseph brought them for help. Miriam is gone. Do you want that for Martha? For John? This isn't about your land. This is about their lives." The standoff lasted for 2 tense hours. It was only the intervention of Joseph, who emerged from the courthouse to face his grandfather's withering gaze, that defused the situation. "I did this, Grandpa," Joseph said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "I brought them here. Because I don't want to watch them die like Miriam. The sickness ain't in the outside world. It's in us. It's in me." He held up his own trembling hands for all to see. The display of raw, painful truth took the fight out of the men. The Shelton contingent, shamed and confused, lowered their rifles and retreated back to the mountains, but the schism was now complete and public. The ensuing court hearing in March 1959 was a landmark, though largely forgotten, case. It pitted family autonomy against the state's responsibility to protect children from preventable harm. Dr. Wainwright returned to testify, explaining the cold, hard math of genetics to a packed, silent courtroom. "What we're observing is not neglect in the traditional sense," she explained, her voice clear and calm. The Shelton family clearly loves these children. However, the practice of consanguineous marriage over multiple generations has created a medical emergency. These children are suffering from preventable genetic disorders that will likely shorten their lives and cause significant suffering. To return them to an environment where the root cause of their affliction is not only unchecked but actively perpetuated would be, in my professional opinion, a death sentence. Judge Davis's ruling was swift. Martha and John Shelton would remain wards of the Commonwealth. The decision sent a shockwave through every isolated hollow in Appalachia. For families like the Rosses and Bennetts, it was a terrifying wake-up call. The old ways were now under the microscope of the state. For the Sheltons, it was the end of their world. Elijah and his loyalists retreated to their compound, bitter and defeated, vowing never to let another outsider cross their threshold. Joseph and a handful of other young adults, those who saw hope in the rupture, left the mountain for good, settling in Boonville, where they faced a different kind of struggle, the stigma of their name and their visible differences. Dr. Harrington and Dr. Wainwright now had a mandate. With the children in state care, they could begin proper studies. Martha and John were taken to the University of Kentucky Medical Center. They were poked, prodded, and tested with the era's limited technology. Electroencephalograms, EEGs, revealed bizarre, chaotic brainwave patterns unlike anything the neurologists had seen. The pattern of electrical activity suggests a fundamental difference in how signals are transmitted through the central nervous system, reported Dr. Franklin Pierce, the attending neurologist. This isn't simply a case of developmental delay. It appears to be a unique neurological condition. The children became living textbooks, their bodies offering up clues. Blood samples were drawn and stored, awaiting a future where genetic science could catch up to their condition. Joseph, true to his word, never married. His own condition worsened steadily. By 1965, at 29, he needed help with basic tasks like eating and dressing. Dr. Harrington visited him often in his small Boonville boarding house, the two men bound by the shared, heavy knowledge of the Shelton curse. "I may not have much time left before the shakes take me completely," Joseph told Harrington during an examination in 1960. "But I made sure those kids have a chance at something different. And I won't be having children of my own. The sickness stops with me." In 1962, Dr. Wainwright secured a major NIH grant for a comprehensive genetic study. Her team set up a field lab in Boonville and, over 2 years, collected blood and histories from 67 members of the extended Shelton-Ross-Bennett kindred. The resulting 1964 paper, Genetic Load in an Isolated Appalachian Kindred, was a bombshell in medical genetics. It identified the specific autosomal recessive mutation responsible for Shelton's neurological deterioration, a defect in a protein crucial for neurotransmitter metabolism. The condition was officially named Shelton-Wainwright syndrome. The family that had hidden in the shadows for a century now had its name immortalized in medical literature. The 1970s saw slow but real progress. Based on international collaborations, an experimental protein replacement therapy was developed. Martha and John were among the first recipients. For Martha, it was a lifeline. Her tremors stabilized, she learned to read at a basic level, graduated from a special education program, and eventually lived a semi-independent life. She became a quiet advocate, her very existence a testament to the power of intervention. John was less fortunate, his disease progressed, and he required full-time institutional care until his death in 1980. Joseph Shelton died in December 1969, at age 33. His obituary was brief, but his legacy was immense. In 1985, the University of Kentucky established the Joseph Shelton Memorial Fund for Genetic Research. At the dedication, Martha Shelton, then 32, stood before the crowd. Her speech was halting, affected by her condition, but her message was profound. "My cousin Joseph," she said, "used to say that knowing the truth might hurt, but not knowing would hurt worse. Because of him, many families now know the truth about their health. That knowledge is power." Today, The hollow is silent. The cabins have collapsed, their logs reclaimed by moss and fungus. The central clearing is now a meadow, dotted with wildflowers in the spring. But the legacy of the Shelton family endures. It lives on in every genetic counseling session, in every screening for recessive disorders, in the ethical frameworks that guide medical intervention in cultural conflicts. Their story is a haunting Appalachian elegy, a ghost story written not in ectoplasm, but in double helixes. It is a warning about the shadows that gather when the family tree refuses to branch, and a testament to the painful, necessary courage it takes to step out of the darkness, to betray a dying world, and to finally, after generations of silence, let the truth speak.